The German Peasants War. Great Peasants War. A Great Peasants Revolt was a widespread popular revolt in the German-speaking areas of Central Europe from 1524 to 1525. It failed because of the intense opposition of the aristocracy, who slaughtered up to 100,000 of the 300,000 poorly armed peasants and farmers. The survivors were fined and achieved few if any of the goals. The war consisted, like the preceding Bundschuh movement and the Hussite Wars, of a series of both economic and religious revolts in which peasants and farmers, often supported by Protestant clergy, took the lead. The German Peasants' War was Europe's largest and most widespread popular uprising prior to the French Revolution of 1789. The fighting was at its height in the middle of 1525. The war began with separate insurrections, beginning in the southwestern part of what is now Germany and neighboring Alsace, and spread in subsequent insurrections to the central and eastern areas of Germany and present-day Austria. After the uprising in Germany was suppressed, it flared briefly in several Swiss cantons. In mounting their insurrection, peasants faced insurmountable hurdles. The democratic nature of the movement left them without command structure and they lacked artillery and cavalry. Most of them had little, if any, military experience. In combat they often turned and fled, and were massacred by the pursuers. The opposition had experienced military leaders, well-equipped and disciplined armies, and ample funding. The revolt incorporated some principles and rhetoric from the emerging Protestant Reformation, through which the peasants sought freedom and influence. Historians have interpreted the economic aspects of the German Peasants' War differently, and social and cultural historians continue to disagree on its causes and nature. Background. In the 16th century, many parts of Europe had common political links within the Holy Roman Empire, a decentralized entity in which the Holy Roman Emperor himself had little authority outside of his own dynastic lands, which covered only a small fraction of the whole. At the time of the Peasants' War, Charles V, King of Spain, held the position of Holy Roman Emperor. Aristocratic dynasties ruled hundreds of largely independent territories within the framework of the empire, and several dozen others operated as semi-independent city-states. The princes of these dynasties were taxed by the Roman Catholic Church. The princes could only gain economically by breaking away from the Roman Church and establishing a German church under their own control, which would then not be able to tax them as the Roman Church did. Most German princes broke with Rome using the nationalistic slogan of "German money for a German church." Roman civil law. Princes often attempted to force the freer peasants into serfdom by increasing taxes and introducing Roman civil law. Roman civil law advantaged princes who sought to consolidate the power because it brought all land into the personal ownership and eliminated the feudal concept of the land as a trust between lord and peasant that conferred rights as well as obligations on the latter. By maintaining the remnants of the ancient law which legitimized their own rule, they not only elevated the wealth and position in the empire through the confiscation of all property and revenues, but increased the power over their peasant subjects. During the Knights' Revolt, the Knights, the lesser landholders of the Rhineland in western Germany, rose up in rebellion in 1522 to 1523. The rhetoric was religious, and several leaders expressed Luther's ideas on the split with Rome and the new German Church. However, the Knights' Revolt was not fundamentally religious. It was conservative in nature and sought to preserve the feudal order. The knights revolted against the new money order, which was squeezing them out of existence. Luther and Munzer. Martin Luther, the dominant leader of the Reformation in Germany, took a middle course in the Peasants' War. He criticized both the injustices imposed on the peasants and the rashness of the peasants in fighting back. He also tended to support the centralization and urbanization of the economy. This position alienated the lesser nobles but shored up his position with the burghers. Luther argued that work was the chief duty on earth. The duty of the peasants was farm labor and the duty of the ruling classes was upholding the peace. He could not support the peasant war because it broke the peace, and evil he thought greater than the evils the peasants were rebelling against. He also criticized the ruling classes for the merciless suppression of the insurrection. Luther has often been sharply criticized for his position. Thomas Munzer was the most prominent radical reforming preacher who supported the demands of the peasantry, including political and legal rights. Munzer's theology had been developed against a background of social upheaval and widespread religious doubt, and his call for a new world order fused with the political and social demands of the peasantry. In the final weeks of 1524 and the beginning of 1525, Munzer traveled into southwest Germany, where the peasant armies were gathering. Here he would have had contact with some of the leaders, and it is argued that he also had an impact on the formulation of the demands. He spent several weeks in the Klettgau area, and there is some evidence to suggest that he helped the peasants to formulate the grievances. While the famous 12 Articles of the Swabian peasants were certainly not composed by Munzer, at least one important supporting document, the constitutional draft, may well have originated with him. Returning to Saxony and Thuringia in early 1525, he assisted in the organization of the various rebel groups there and ultimately led the rebel army in the ill-fated Battle of Frankenhausen on May 1525. Munzer's role in the Peasant War has been the subject of considerable controversy, some arguing that he had no influence at all, others that he was the sole inspirer of the uprising. To judge from his writings of 1523 and 1524, it was by no means inevitable that Munzer would take the road of social revolution. However, it was precisely on this same theological foundation that Munzer's ideas briefly coincided with the aspirations of the peasants and plebeians of 1525, viewing the uprising as an apocalyptic act of God. He stepped up as God's servant against the godless and took his position as leader of the rebels. Luther and Munzer took every opportunity to attack each other's ideas and actions. Luther himself declared against the moderate demands of the peasantry embodied in the 12 Articles. His article against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants appeared in May 1525, just as the rebels were being defeated on the fields of battle. Social classes in the 16th century Holy Roman Empire. In this era of rapid change, modernizing princes tended to align with clergy burghers against the less nobility and peasants. Princes. Many rulers of Germany's various principalities functioned as autocratic rulers who recognized no other authority within the territories. Princes had the right to levy taxes and borrow money as they saw fit. The growing costs of administration and military upkeep impelled them to keep raising demands on the subjects. The princes also worked to centralize power in the towns and estates. Accordingly, princes tended to gain economically from the ruination of the less nobility by acquiring their estates. This ignited the Knights' Revolt that occurred from 1522 through 1523 in the Rhineland. The revolt was suppressed by both Catholic Catholic and Lutheran princes who were satisfied to cooperate against a common danger, to the degree that other classes, such as the bourgeois, might gain from the centralization of the economy and the elimination of the lesser nobles' territorial controls on manufacture and trade. The princes might unite with the burghers on the issue. Lesser nobility. The evolving military technology of the late medieval period began to render the lesser nobility militarily obsolete. The introduction of military science and the growing importance of gunpowder and infantry lessened the importance of heavy cavalry and of castles. Their luxurious lifestyle drained what little income they had as prices kept rising. They exercised their ancient rights in order to wring income from the territories. In the north of Germany, many of the lesser nobles had already been subordinated to secular and ecclesiastical lords. Thus, their dominance over serfs was more restricted. However, in the south of Germany the powers were more intact. Accordingly, the harshness of the lesser nobles' treatment of the peasantry provided the immediate cause of the uprising. The fact that this treatment was worse in the south than in the north was the reason that the war began in the south. The knights became embittered as the status and income fell, and they came increasingly under the jurisdiction of the princes, putting the two groups in constant conflict. The knights also regarded the clergy as arrogant and superfluous, while envying the privileges and wealth. In addition, the knights' relationships with the patricians in the towns was strained by the debts owed by the knights. At odds with other classes in Germany, the less nobility was the least disposed to change. The less nobility and the clergy paid no taxes and often supported the local prince. Clergy. The clergy in 1525 were the intellectuals of the time. Not only were they literate, but in the Middle Ages they had produced most books. Some clergy were supported by the nobility and the rich, while others appealed to the masses. However, the clergy was beginning to lose its overwhelming intellectual authority. The progress of printing and the expansion of commerce, as well as the spread of Renaissance humanism, raised literacy rates. According to Engels, held that the Catholic monopoly on higher education was accordingly reduced. However, despite the secular nature of 19th-century humanism, 3 centuries earlier Renaissance humanism had still been strongly connected with the Church. Its proponents had attended church schools. Over time, some Catholic institutions had slipped into corruption. Clerical ignorance and the abuses of simony and pluralism were rampant. Some bishops, archbishops, abbots and priors were as ruthless in exploiting the subjects as the regional princes. In addition to the sale of indulgences, they set up prayer houses and directly taxed the people. Increased indignation over church corruption had led the monk Martin Luther to post his 95 Theses on the doors of the castle church in Wittenberg, Germany, in 1517, as well as impelling other reformers to radically rethink church doctrine and organization. The clergy who did not follow Luther tended to be the aristocratic clergy, who opposed all change, including any break with the Roman Church. The poorer clergy, rural and urban itinerant preachers who were not well positioned in the Church, were more likely to join the Reformation. Some of the poorer clergy sought to extend Luther's equalizing ideas to society at large. Patricians. Many towns had privileges that exempted them from taxes, so that the bulk of taxation fell on the peasants. As the guilds grew and urban populations rose, the town patricians faced increasing opposition. The patricians consisted of wealthy families who sat alone in the town councils and held all the administrative offices. Like the princes, they sought to secure revenues from the peasants by any possible means. Arbitrary road, bridge, and gate tolls were instituted at will. They gradually revoked the common lands and made it illegal for peasants to fish or to log wood from these lands. Guild taxes were exacted. No revenues collected were subject to formal administration, and civic accounts were neglected. Thus embezzlement and fraud became common, and the patrician class, bound by family ties, became wealthier and more powerful. Burghers. The town patricians were increasingly criticized by the growing burgher class, which consisted of well-to-do middle-class citizens who held administrative guild positions or worked as merchants. They demanded town assemblies made up of both patricians and burghers, or at least a restriction on simony and the allocation of council seats to burghers. The burghers also opposed the clergy, whom they felt had overstepped and failed to uphold the principles. They demanded an end to the clergy's special privileges such as their exemption from taxation, as well as a reduction in the numbers. The burgomaster now owned both his workshop and its tools, which he allowed his apprentices to use, and provided the materials that his workers needed. F. Engels cites, to the call of Luther of rebellion against the Church, two political uprisings responded. First, the one of lower nobility, headed by Franz von Sickingen in 1523, and then, the Great Peasants War in 1525. Both were crushed because, mainly, of the indecisiveness of the party having most interest in the fight, the urban bourgeoisie. Plebeians. The plebeians comprised the new class of urban workers, journeymen, and peddlers. Ruined burghers also joined the ranks. Although technically potential burghers, most journeymen were barred from higher positions by the wealthy families who ran the guilds. Thus their temporary position devoid of civic rights tended to become permanent. The plebeians did not have property like ruined burghers or peasants. Peasants. The heavily taxed peasantry continued to occupy the lowest stratum of society. In the early 16th century, no peasant could hunt, fish, or chop wood freely, as they previously had, because the lords had recently taken control of common lands. The lord had the right to use his peasant's land as he wished. The peasant could do nothing but watch as his crops were destroyed by wild game and by nobles galloping across his fields in the course of chivalric hunts. When a peasant wished to marry, he not only needed the lord's permission but had to pay a tax. When the peasant died, the lord was entitled to his best cattle, his best garments, and his best tools. The justice system, operated by the clergy, a wealthy burgher, and patrician jurists, gave the peasant no redress. Generations of traditional servitude and the autonomous nature of the provinces limited peasant insurrections to local areas. Military organizations. Army of the Swabian League. The Swabian League fielded an army commanded by Georg Truxas von Warburg, later known as Bauernjörg, for his role in the suppression of the revolt. He was also known as the Scourge of the Peasants. The League headquarters was based in Ulm, and command was exercised through a war council which decided the troop contingents to be levied from each member. Depending on the capability, members contributed a specific number of mounted knights and foot soldiers, called a contingent, to the League's army. The Bishop of Augsburg, for example, had to contribute 10 horse and 62 foot soldiers, which would be the equivalent of a half company. At the beginning of the revolt, the League members had trouble recruiting soldiers from among their own populations due to fear of them joining the rebels. As the rebellion expanded, many nobles had trouble sending troops to the League armies because they had to combat rebel groups in their own lands. Another common problem regarding raising armies was that while nobles were obligated to provide troops to a member of the League, they also had other obligations to other lords. These conditions created problems and confusion for the nobles as they tried to gather together forces large enough to put down the revolts. Foot soldiers were drawn from the ranks of the Landsknechte. These were mercenaries, usually paid a monthly wage of 4 guilders, and organized into regiments and companies of 120 to 300 men, which distinguished it from others. Each company, in turn, was composed of smaller units of 10 to 12 men, known as rot. The Landsknechte clothed, armed and fed themselves, and were accompanied by a sizable train of sutlers, bakers, washerwomen, prostitutes and sundry individuals with occupations needed to sustain the force. Trains were sometimes larger than the fighting force, but they required organization and discipline. Each Landsknecht maintained its own structure, called the Gemeiin, or community assembly, which was symbolized by a ring. The Semeiin had its own leader, and a provost officer who policed the ranks and maintained order. The use of the Landsknechte in the German Peasants' War reflects a period of change between traditional noble roles and responsibilities towards warfare and practice of buying mercenary armies, which became the norm throughout the 16th century. The League relied on the armored cavalry of the nobility for the bulk of its strength. The League had both heavy cavalry and light cavalry, which served as a vanguard. Typically, the Reinfein were the second and third sons of poor knights, the lower and sometimes impoverished nobility with small landholdings, or, in the case of second and third sons, no inheritance or social role. These men could often be found roaming the countryside looking for work or engaging in highway robbery. To be effective, the cavalry needed to be mobile, and to avoid hostile forces armed with pikes. Peasant armies. The peasant armies were organized in bands, similar to the Landsknecht. Each Haufen was organized into Unterhaufen or Fähnlein and Rotten. The bands varied in size, depending on the number of insurgents available in the locality. Peasant Haufen divided along territorial lines, whereas those of the Landsknecht drew men from a variety of territories. Some bands could number about 4,000. Others, such as the peasant force at Frankenhausen, could gather 8,000. The Alsatian peasants who took to the field at the Battle of Zabern numbered 18,000. Haufen were formed from companies, typically 500 men per company, subdivided into platoons of 10 to 15 peasants each. Like the Landsknechts, the peasant bands used similar titles: Oberster Feldhauptmann, or Supreme Commander, similar to a colonel, and lieutenants, or Leutnant. Each company was commanded by a captain and had its own Fahnenrück, or ensign, who carried the company's standard. The companies also had a sergeant, a Feldwebel, and squadron leaders called Rotmeister, or masters of the Rot. Officers were usually elected, particularly the supreme commander and the Leutnant. The peasant army was governed by a so-called ring, in which peasants gathered in a circle to debate tactics, troop movements, alliances, and the distribution of spoils. The ring was the decision-making body. In addition to this democratic construct, each band had a hierarchy of leaders including a supreme commander and a marshal, who maintained law and order. Other roles included lieutenants, captains, standard-bearers, master gunner, wagon fort master, train master, 4 watchmasters, 4 sergeant majors to arrange the order of battle, a Weibel for each company, 2 quartermasters, farriers, quartermasters for the horses, a communications officer and a pillage master. Peasant resources. The peasants possessed an important resource, the skills to build and maintain fieldworks. They used the wagon fort effectively, a tactic that had been mastered in the Hussite Wars of the previous century. Wagons were chained together in a suitable defensive location, with cavalry and draft animals placed in the center. Peasants dug ditches around the outer edge of the fort and used timber to close gaps between and underneath the wagons. In the Hussite Wars, artillery was usually placed in the center on raised mounds of earth that allowed them to fire over the wagons. Wagon forts could be erected and dismantled quickly. They were quite mobile, but they also had drawbacks. attacks. They required a fairly large area of flat terrain, and they were not ideal for offense. Since their earlier use, artillery had increased in range and power. Peasants served in rotation, sometimes for 1 week in 4, and returned to the villages after service. While the men served, others absorbed the workload. This sometimes meant producing supplies for their opponents, such as in the Archbishopric of Salzburg, where men worked to extract silver, which was used to hire fresh contingents of landsknechts for the Swabian League. However, the peasants lacked the Swabian League's cavalry, having few horses and little armor. They seem to have used the mounted men for reconnaissance. The lack of cavalry with which to protect the flanks, and with which to penetrate massed landsknecht squares, proved to be a long-term tactical and strategic problem. Causes. Historians disagree on the nature of the revolt and its causes, whether it grew out of the emerging religious controversy centered on Luther, whether a wealthy tier of peasants saw their own wealth and rights slipping away, and sought to weave them into the legal, social and religious fabric of society, or whether peasants objected to the emergence of a modernizing, centralizing nation-state. Threat to prosperity. One view is that the origins of the German Peasants' War lay partly in the unusual power dynamic caused by the agricultural and economic dynamism of the previous decades. Labor shortages in the last half of the 14th century had allowed peasants to sell their labor for a higher price. Food and goods shortages had allowed them to sell the products for a higher price as well. Consequently, some peasants, particularly those who had limited allodial requirements, were able to accrue significant economic, social, and legal advantages. Peasants were more concerned to protect the social, economic and legal gains they had made than about seeking further gains. Serfdom. Their attempt to break new ground was primarily seeking to increase the liberty by changing their status from serfs, such as the infamous moment when the peasants of Mühlhausen refused to collect snail shells around which the lady could wind her thread. The renewal of the seigneurial system had weakened in the previous half-century, and peasants were unwilling to see it restored. Luther's Reformation. People in all layers of the social hierarchy, serfs or city dwellers, guildsmen, farmers, knights and aristocrats, started to question the established hierarchy. The so-called Book of 100 Chapters, for example, written between 1501 and 1513, promoted religious and economic freedom, attacking the governing establishment and displaying pride in the virtuous peasant. The Bundschuh revolts of the first 20 years of the century offered another avenue for the expression of anti-authoritarian ideas, and for the spread of these ideas from one geographic region to another. Luther's revolution may have added intensity to these movements, but did not create them. The two events, Luther's Protestant Reformation and the German Peasants' War, were separate events, sharing the same years, but occurring independently. However, Luther's doctrine of the priesthood of all believers could be interpreted as proposing greater social equality than Luther intended. Luther vehemently opposed the revolts, writing the pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants, in which he remarks, "Let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, secretly or openly. Nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. It is just as one must kill a mad dog. If you do not strike him, he will strike you." Historian Roland Bainton saw the revolt as a struggle that began as an upheaval immersed in the rhetoric of Luther's Protestant Reformation against the Catholic Church, but which really was impelled far beyond the narrow religious confines by the underlying economic tensions of the time. Class struggle. The communist philosopher Friedrich Engels interpreted the war as a case in which an emerging proletariat failed to assert a sense of its own autonomy in the face of princely power and left the rural classes to their fate.